Mark Miller sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee. The house was quiet, with the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. His wife, Lisa, had already left for work, and his son, Ben, was still upstairs, probably cramming last-minute items into his suitcase for their upcoming college tour. From the outside, Mark's life looked perfect. He was in his early 40s, working as a marketing manager at a small company in the heart of the city. His job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed him to spend time with his family. His wife, Lisa, a high school teacher, was warm and kind. Together, they'd built a cozy home in a quiet neighborhood. Their son, Ben, smart and driven, was on the verge of applying to college, and Mark couldn't have been prouder. But as he sat there staring into his coffee, Mark felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. It was the same feeling he'd been having for months. Something just didn't feel right. He wasn't unhappy exactly. His family was wonderful, and they had a good life. But still, there was an emptiness, a sense that something was missing. The college trip they were about to take wasn't just for Ben. It was also stirring something inside Mark, a reflection on his own past. His mind drifted to his college days, how full of dreams and ambition he'd been back then. He and his friends had talked about changing the world, making a name for themselves, but here he was 20 years later, living an ordinary life. Had he done enough? Was this what success looked like? Mark's thoughts wandered to Tom Anderson, his best friend from college. Tom had always been the one everyone admired, charismatic, intelligent, and always one step ahead of everyone else. While Mark had taken the steady path, settling into a stable career and family life, Tom had gone on to become a successful entrepreneur. His company had made headlines, and he lived in a sprawling mansion on the West Coast. Whenever Mark saw Tom's posts on social media, pictures of luxury vacations, flashy cars, and award ceremonies, it was like a reminder of how different their lives had turned out. Mark shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He didn't want to be the guy who compared himself to others, but it was hard not to. Tom seemed to have everything Mark once thought he wanted. And now, as he watched Ben prepare for his future, those old dreams resurfaced. What had happened to his own ambitions? When did he stop chasing big things and settle for good enough? Just then, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Ben came down the stairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a messy pile of clothes tucked under his arm. "Dad, do you think I'll have enough room for this?" Ben asked, dropping the clothes onto a nearby chair. Mark smiled, grateful for the distraction. "If you can fit all that in your suitcase, I'll be impressed." Ben grinned, clearly excited about the trip. "I still can't believe we're finally visiting colleges. It feels so grown up." Mark nodded, but inside he felt a pang of anxiety. He remembered feeling just as excited when he was Ben's age, ready to take on the world. He wondered if Ben would look back 20 years from now and feel the same way he did, unsure if he had really achieved what he set out to do. "We're leaving in an hour," Mark said, checking his watch. "You ready?" "Almost," Ben said, grabbing the pile of clothes and heading back upstairs. As Mark watched him go, he couldn't help but think about the future. Not just Ben's, but his own. What was next for him? Would he spend the next few years just coasting along in his job, doing the same routine day in and day out? Or was there still time to chase something bigger, something that would make him feel as alive as he did back in college? He stood up and carried his coffee mug to the sink, gazing out the kitchen window. The neighborhood was still and peaceful, but inside his mind there was a storm of questions. Maybe this trip wasn't just about helping Ben find his path. Maybe it was about Mark figuring out where he went wrong, or more importantly, where he could still go. "Dad, I'm all packed," Ben's voice called from upstairs. Mark took a deep breath and turned away from the window. "Great," he called back, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. "Let's hit the road." As they loaded the car, Mark couldn't help but glance at his phone. A new photo from Tom popped up on his social media feed. This time, it was a picture of Tom at some charity gala, dressed in a sleek black suit, shaking hands with a famous actor. Mark sighed and put his phone away, resolving not to look at it again. For now, he needed to focus on Ben. This was Ben's time to shine, and Mark was determined to be there for him. But deep down, he knew the trip would be just as much about his own journey as it was about his son's. As they pulled out of the driveway and headed toward the open road, Mark couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to change his own story? Or had his perfect picture been enough all along? The highway stretched out ahead, long and straight under the bright autumn sun. Mark and Ben had been driving for hours, the car filled with the sound of road noise and the occasional click of the turn signal. They were on their way to the first university on Ben's list, a prestigious school with a campus that sprawled over acres of green hills. Ben was excited, tapping away on his phone, looking up more information about the school and its programs. "You know," Ben said, glancing over at his dad, "I've been thinking about majoring in computer science. It's a good field, and they have some amazing professors at this place." Mark smiled. "That sounds like a solid plan. Computer science is in demand." Ben nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, and they have these really cool research labs. Some of their graduates have started their own tech companies or gone on to work for places like Google and Facebook." As Ben spoke, Mark felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was proud. His son was smart, driven, and clearly excited about the future. But there was also a creeping sense of inadequacy. He couldn't help but compare Ben's boundless ambition to his own path, which had once been just as filled with dreams and potential. And yet here he was in his early 40s, driving a used sedan to visit colleges for his son, while his best friend from college, Tom, was probably flying in a private jet somewhere, living the life they had all once imagined for themselves. The first college they visited was impressive. As they walked through the gates, they were greeted by a student guide, full of energy, talking about the history of the school and its academic excellence. Mark couldn't help but notice how everything seemed bigger, better, and more exciting than he remembered from his own college days. The buildings were modern, the facilities state-of-the-art, and the students all looked so sure of themselves. Ben fit right in. He asked thoughtful questions during the tour, engaged with the professors, and even struck up a conversation with a few current students about their experiences. Watching him, Mark felt a swell of pride. His son was confident and curious, ready to take on the world. But as Ben navigated the campus with ease, Mark's insecurities started to bubble up again. He remembered how ambitious he had been at Ben's age, how he and his friends had stayed up late in their dorm rooms, talking about the big things they were going to do. But somewhere along the way, life had settled into routine. Mark had taken a stable job, started a family, and before he knew it, the years had passed by. He had done everything right, but it didn't feel like enough. As they made their way to the next college on the tour, Mark overheard snippets of conversation from other parents. A man in a crisp suit was talking to his wife about their daughter's accomplishments. "She's already got 3 internships lined up for the summer," he said proudly. "One of them is at a tech startup in Silicon Valley." Another woman wearing designer sunglasses chimed in, "Our son is applying to Harvard and Yale. He's been working on his college essays for months now, and his SAT scores were in the 99th percentile. Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't that he didn't think Ben could achieve great things. He believed in his son. But listening to these other parents, he couldn't help but feel like they were all living in a different world. A world where their children were already on a fast track to success, while Mark had barely figured out his own path. Ben, however, seemed unfazed by the pressure. He walked confidently through each campus, talking about the future as if it were something just waiting for him to grab. He mentioned clubs he wanted to join, internships he hoped to apply for, and places he wanted to travel to after graduation. His plans were big, bold, and full of possibility. "I could even see myself studying abroad for a semester," Ben said as they sat down for lunch at the campus cafeteria. "Maybe in Europe or even Asia. They've got some great exchange programs here." Mark nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Ben was dreaming big, and Mark didn't want to dampen that. But as he listened, he couldn't shake the feeling that his own dreams had faded too soon. He had always thought there would be more time, more opportunities, but life had a way of speeding up, of taking control. As they continued their tour, Mark noticed more and more parents talking about their own achievements as much as their kids. A man they met during a group tour bragged about his position as a senior partner in a law firm, casually mentioning his second home in the Hamptons. Another parent spoke about their success in the medical field, while their child had already been published in scientific journals before even graduating high school. Mark felt more and more like he didn't belong in these conversations. His own life was ordinary by comparison. He didn't have flashy titles or extravagant stories to tell. He was just a guy who worked in marketing, who had done his best to provide for his family. But as he listened to these other parents, he wondered if doing his best had ever been enough. Later that evening, after a long day of campus tours and conversations, Mark and Ben checked into their hotel. Ben was excitedly going over brochures, making notes, and talking about all the schools they had seen. "This place could be it, Dad," Ben said, holding up a brochure from one of the universities. "It's got everything I'm looking for." Mark smiled. "I'm glad you're excited, Ben. You've got a bright future ahead of you." Ben looked at him, his eyes full of hope and certainty. "You think so?" "I know so," Mark said, his voice steady, but inside the doubt still lingered. As Ben went back to his notes, Mark lay down on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The trip was supposed to be about Ben's future, but Mark couldn't help but think about his own past, what he had hoped for, and what had become of those hopes. He wanted to feel proud not just of Ben, but of himself. But with each conversation, each college visit, he felt more and more like he had fallen short of the life he once imagined. The silence in the room was heavy, and for the first time on the trip, Mark found himself wondering, had he ever really reached his potential? Or was it too late to change the course of his life now? The drive to Tom Anderson's house felt longer than it should have. Mark hadn't seen his old friend in years, but Tom had been quick to respond when he'd reached out, insisting they meet for dinner while Mark and Ben were in town. "Come over to my place," Tom had said with the same confident tone that Mark remembered from their college days. "I'll make sure you and Ben have a night to remember." Mark had agreed, although now as he followed the GPS directions through the upscale neighborhood, he felt a knot forming in his stomach. He glanced over at Ben, who was scrolling through his phone, oblivious to his father's growing unease. Ben was excited to meet Tom, mostly because Mark had mentioned Tom's success. The car turned a corner, and there it was, Tom's house, or more accurately, his mansion. It stood tall at the end of a long driveway, with perfectly manicured lawns, tall trees, and a sleek sports car parked in front. The modern architecture, all glass and steel, gleamed in the fading evening light. Mark couldn't help but feel small as he pulled up next to the car in his sensible sedan. "Wow," Ben said, his eyes wide. "This place is insane." Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, Tom's done well for himself." As they got out of the car, the front door swung open, and Tom appeared. He hadn't changed much since college, still tall and fit, his hair only slightly grayer. He wore a tailored suit, though it looked like the kind of casual wear that only the ultra-rich could pull off. His smile was broad and confident as he waved them over. "Mark, it's been too long," Tom said, pulling Mark into a bear hug. "And this must be Ben. Wow, you've grown up fast." Ben shook Tom's hand, clearly impressed. "It's great to meet you, Mr. Anderson." "Call me Tom," he said with a laugh, clapping Ben on the shoulder. "Let's get you two inside. Dinner's almost ready, and I've got a chef preparing something special." Mark's stomach tightened again. A private chef? Of course. Tom had a chef. As they walked into the house, the interior was just as impressive as the exterior. Spacious, filled with sleek furniture, and decorated with modern art. Huge windows overlooked the city below, and everything seemed designed to make a statement. It was the kind of life that screamed success. They sat down in the dining room, where the chef soon appeared with a series of beautifully plated dishes. The conversation started light, with Tom asking about the colleges Ben was considering, and Ben eagerly talking about his plans. "I'm looking into computer science," Ben said, his enthusiasm shining through. "I want to learn about AI and maybe even start my own company someday." Tom smiled approvingly. "Smart move. AI is the future. If you ever need advice on startups, you can always come to me. My tech firm's been working on some AI projects for years now." Mark smiled, but inside he felt that familiar pang of inadequacy. Tom's company wasn't just successful, it was cutting edge, shaping the future. As dinner progressed, Tom talked about his travels, business trips to Europe, vacations in the Caribbean, and high-profile meetings with investors and celebrities. He casually mentioned a charity event he had attended the previous week, where he'd rubbed shoulders with movie stars and politicians. Mark tried to keep up, nodding and offering polite responses, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. He glanced at Ben, who was listening intently, clearly fascinated by Tom's stories. Mark felt a pang of guilt. Was he failing his son by not being more successful, more ambitious? Was this the kind of future Ben deserved? After dinner, they moved to the living room for coffee. The conversation drifted back to old college memories, and for a brief moment, Mark felt comfortable again. He and Tom laughed about their wild college days, the late-night study sessions, and the dreams they had shared. But then Tom steered the conversation back to his present-day life, talking about the latest business venture he was involved in, a new tech startup that was already making waves in Silicon Valley. By the time they left Tom's house, Mark was emotionally drained. Ben seemed energized, talking excitedly about Tom's company and the possibilities in the tech world. But Mark barely heard him. His thoughts were elsewhere, swirling in a storm of self-doubt and regret. Later that night, in the quiet of their hotel room, Mark called Lisa. He needed to talk to her, to let out everything that had been building up inside him. "Hey," he said softly when she answered. "Hey, how's the trip going?" Lisa's voice was warm and comforting, but Mark found it hard to speak. "It's good," he said, though it felt like a lie. "We had dinner with Tom tonight." "How was that?" Mark hesitated, then finally let out a long sigh. "It was weird. I don't know. He's doing so well, Lisa. His company's huge, his house is incredible, and he's rubbing shoulders with all these important people. And I feel like I'm stuck, like I've done nothing with my life compared to him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Lisa spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Mark, you know success isn't just about money or fame. You've built a life, a family. You've raised an amazing son, and you've given him everything he needs to succeed. That's something to be proud of." "I know," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't help comparing myself to him. I feel like I've missed out on something, like I could have done more." Lisa's words were calm, but they carried weight. "Mark, everyone's journey is different. Tom has his life, but that doesn't mean yours is any less valuable. You've built something real, something lasting. Don't let someone else's story make you doubt your own." Mark closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. She was right, of course, but the doubts were still there, nagging at the edges of his mind. He wanted to believe that his life had meaning, that the choices he had made were enough. But after seeing Tom's world, it was hard not to feel small in comparison. "I'll try," Mark said quietly. Lisa's voice softened. "Just remember, you're enough, Mark. You always have been." After they hung up, Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He knew Lisa was right. Deep down, he knew that success wasn't just about wealth or status. But as the night stretched on, his self-doubt lingered like a shadow, following him even into his dreams. The days passed quickly as Mark and Ben continued their college visits. Each campus had its own charm. Grand lecture halls, beautifully landscaped quads, and modern labs filled with cutting-edge technology. But something felt different on this leg of their trip. While Ben had been full of excitement and energy at the start, Mark began to notice a shift. Ben seemed quieter, less eager to ask questions during the tours, and he no longer talked about the schools with the same enthusiasm as before. It wasn't until they were on their way to visit yet another prestigious university that Mark finally spoke up. "Everything okay, Ben?" he asked, glancing over at his son in the passenger seat. "You've been pretty quiet the last few days." Ben hesitated, staring out the window as the trees blurred past. "Yeah, I've just been thinking a lot." Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He'd been expecting Ben to make some big decision about which school to apply to, but his son's tone made him wonder if something else was going on. "Thinking about what?" There was a long pause before Ben finally spoke again. "I don't know if I want to go to one of these big schools," he said quietly. "I mean, they're amazing, but I don't know if they're right for me." Mark's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Really? You seemed so excited about them when we first started the tour." "I was," Ben admitted, "but the more I see, the more I realize that maybe that's not what I want." Mark pulled the car into a rest stop and parked. He turned to face Ben, concern etched on his face. "What do you mean? I thought you wanted to study computer science at one of these top schools." Ben sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I do like computer science, and I do want to go to college. But these schools, they feel like they're all about status. about showing off how successful you are. I've been listening to all these parents talk about their kids like it's some kind of competition, and I don't want that. I don't want to spend my life chasing something just because it looks good on paper. Mark sat back, stunned. Ben's words hit him harder than he expected. He had always thought of Ben as driven and ambitious, someone who knew what he wanted. But now his son was voicing the same doubts that Mark himself had been grappling with for years. I get that, Mark said slowly, but these schools could open a lot of doors for you. I know, Ben said, nodding, but I don't want to go somewhere just because it's prestigious. I want to go somewhere that feels right for me, somewhere I can actually be happy. Mark felt a pang in his chest. Happy. It seemed so simple, but that word carried so much weight. He had spent so many years chasing success, worrying about whether he measured up, that he had lost sight of what happiness really meant. He had been so focused on making sure Ben had every opportunity that he hadn't stopped to ask what Ben actually wanted. So, what are you thinking? Mark asked carefully. Ben looked down at his hands, thinking hard before speaking. There's this smaller school that's not as well known, but I've read about their program and it sounds amazing. They focus more on hands-on learning and creativity. It's not a top-ranked school, but it just feels like a better fit for me. I don't care if people don't know its name. I just want to learn, be myself, and find something I love doing. Mark was quiet for a moment, absorbing his son's words. He was surprised by how mature Ben's perspective was, but also deeply moved. For so long, Mark had been stuck in the idea that success had to be measured by external achievements, money, status, prestige. But here was his son standing at the crossroads of his future and choosing happiness and fulfillment over reputation. It was a choice Mark hadn't been able to make for himself. You're right, Mark said finally, his voice soft. Success isn't just about the name of the school or how much money you make. It's about finding something you love, something that makes you happy. I'm proud of you for realizing that. Ben looked up at his dad, his eyes searching. You mean that? Yeah, Mark said, nodding. I mean that. I think I've spent too much of my life worrying about what I didn't achieve instead of appreciating what I have. But you've got it right. If you follow what makes you happy, the rest will fall into place. For the first time in days, Ben smiled. It was a small smile, but it was full of relief. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. Mark sat back in his seat, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He realized that in helping Ben make this decision, he had come to an important realization about himself. His life wasn't defined by what he hadn't accomplished, or by the success of his friends like Tom. His life was full of meaning, in the family he had raised, in the love he had given, and in the simple, quiet moments of joy he had too often overlooked. They sat in the car for a few moments, the sounds of the highway outside fading into the background. Mark felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. Ben had taught him something valuable today, something that he had been searching for but hadn't known how to find. Happiness wasn't about living up to someone else's standards. It was about finding your own path and being content with where it led you. You know, Mark said after a while, I think that smaller school sounds perfect for you. Let's go visit it. Ben's smile widened, and for the first time in days, he looked excited again. Yeah, let's do that. As they pulled back onto the road, Mark felt like they were heading somewhere important, not just toward Ben's future, but toward a new understanding of what really mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Mark wasn't worried about keeping up with anyone else. He was exactly where he needed to be. The last day of their trip dawned with the soft glow of morning light streaming through the hotel window. Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling different than he had at the start of the journey. It wasn't just the fatigue from days of college visits. It was something deeper, a quiet sense of acceptance he hadn't felt in years. Ben was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, flipping through a brochure for the small college they had visited the day before. Mark smiled to himself, seeing his son so absorbed, so sure of what he wanted. It was as if Ben had already found his path, while Mark was only just beginning to understand his own. Thinking about the school? Mark asked, sitting up. Ben nodded without looking up from the brochure. Yeah, I really liked it there. It feels right. Mark joined him by the window, the city still sleepy outside. the sun just starting to warm the streets. I think it's a great choice, Ben. You'll do amazing things there. Ben glanced at him, a small smile on his lips. Thanks, Dad. I feel good about it too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city wake up. Mark couldn't help but reflect on the trip, the conversations they'd had, the places they'd visited, and the things he had learned, not just about Ben, but about himself. The self-doubt that had weighed so heavily on him in the beginning had started to lift, replaced by a quiet realization. He had been chasing the wrong idea of success for years. Seeing Tom's life had only amplified his insecurities. But now, with some distance, Mark could see things more clearly. Tom's path was Tom's path, and there was no need for Mark to measure his own life against it. His life, with Lisa and Ben, was full of meaning, full of love. And wasn't that in itself a success? Later that day, as they packed up their things and prepared to head home, Mark felt lighter. He and Ben talked about their favorite parts of the trip, laughed about the strange parents they had met, and shared quiet moments of reflection. But something had shifted in their relationship too. Mark no longer felt the need to project his own worries onto Ben. Instead, he felt proud. Proud of the young man Ben was becoming, and proud of the father he had been. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their home, Mark saw Lisa standing on the porch, waiting for them with a smile. Ben was the first out of the car, his excitement bubbling over as he rushed to tell his mom all about the trip. Mark watched them from a distance for a moment, taking in the scene. This was his life, his family, and for the first time, he felt truly content. Lisa looked up as Mark approached, her eyes full of warmth. "How was the trip?" Mark smiled, wrapping his arms around her in a hug. "It was eye-opening. We learned a lot." She looked at him curiously. "You sound different. What happened out there?" Mark chuckled softly. "I think I learned a little something about myself. And I realized, I've been too hard on myself, Lisa. I've spent so much time comparing my life to others, feeling like I wasn't doing enough, like I hadn't achieved enough. But standing here now with you and Ben, I see it differently." Lisa smiled knowingly. "And what do you see?" "I see that I've got everything I need right here. I don't need to be rich or famous to be successful. I just need to be present, to appreciate what I have. You and Ben, you're my success." Her eyes softened, and she kissed him gently on the cheek. "You've always been enough, Mark. I'm glad you're starting to see it too." That evening, after dinner, Mark and Ben found themselves sitting on the porch together, watching the stars blink into the sky. The air was cool and calm, the kind of quiet that made the world feel just a little bit bigger. Mark looked over at Ben, who was leaning back in his chair, staring up at the stars with a contented smile. "You know," Ben said after a while, "I'm really glad we took this trip. I wasn't sure about everything at first, but now, it feels right." Mark nodded. "Yeah, me too." They sat in silence for a few more moments before Ben turned to him. "Dad, do you ever wonder if you made the right choices in life?" Mark paused, considering the question carefully. A few days ago, he might have answered differently, but now the answer came easily. I used to wonder that a lot. I used to worry that I hadn't done enough, or that I hadn't lived up to my potential. But after this trip, I've realized something important." "What's that?" "That success isn't about making the right choices all the time, or about measuring yourself against other people. It's about finding happiness in the choices you do make, and learning to be okay with where you are. I've got you and your mom. I've got a life I'm proud of, and that's enough for me." Ben smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I think that's a good way to look at it." Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his past worries lift. "I'm proud of you, Ben, not because of what school you choose or what job you get in the future, but because of who you are. You're going to be just fine." Ben looked over at him, his eyes bright. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." They sat there together, the stars twinkling overhead, the night peaceful around them. In that moment, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. He had finally let go of the expectations that had weighed him down for so long. His journey, his path was his own, and it had led him to a place of love, contentment, and joy.